going to be moderating our discussion today. So welcome, and I'm going to hand it over to you and let you introduce our other guests.
Thanks, Doug. And it's really been thrilling to work with you. Although I think we all have a little COVID fatigue, I think our work is as meaningful and important now. And it's great that we'll have audience tonight to engage and ask questions of my dear colleague, who is the Chief of Infectious Disease at Cambridge Health Alliance, Dr. Luann Bruno-Murtha. Thanks, Luann, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Doug. Happy to be here.
So we thought we'd get started off tonight because Luann has some slides that will be really informative to everybody at home that we'll walk through. You are welcome to be putting your questions in the chat. We'll make sure we get to them. But there's a lot going on. It is not slowed down, but we're excited to talk not only about COVID and the caseloads, but also to talk about vaccinations, what it all means, and new information about the vaccinations. So here we go. Thanks, Luann.
Thanks, Mary. And I just have a few slides because I really want this evening to be for you, the participants, to have an opportunity to ask questions, but just to frame some of the issues that we're dealing with. So currently in Massachusetts, we are dealing with a recent increase in cases, although I'm hopeful that perhaps it's plateauing. It's a little soon to tell. And, you know, we're right here. This is data as of yesterday. So maybe we're plateauing here. We had about 2,000 cases reported in the state today. So I'm optimistic, but I'm also cautious. And the reason why I say I'm cautious is because I know there are states in the Midwest that are actually going through their third surge. And just to make the point that we still need to be careful. Because what's happened in the past, after the Midwest has surged, then the Northeast has surged. So the need for ongoing vigilance. But I also want to show you what we're doing in the state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts has done extremely well with administering their vaccines. They have received almost 5 million doses of vaccines and administered almost 86% of the vaccines that they've received, which is really quite good. So right now in the state of Massachusetts, we have 26% of our residents fully vaccinated and 44% who have received at least one dose. So we are doing very well. We are not at the point, though, that we have reached what has been termed herd immunity, that point where we feel as though this infection is going to start to burn out. We're not there yet. It's probably several months away before we actually attain that goal. And as you know, in the state of Massachusetts, we have a lot of people eligible for vaccination. And as of next Monday, Patriots Day, everyone from the age of 16 and above will be eligible to schedule a vaccination. So that's really phenomenal news. Now, we've had 3 vaccines available to us. And as many of you know, yesterday we learned that the Janssen or J&J vaccine was put on pause. So in essence, we actually have 2 vaccines now that are being administered. Massachusetts stopped administering the Janssen or J&J vaccine until the ACIP, that's the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and the FDA have an opportunity to look more carefully at the 6 reported cases of an unusual blood clot situation that's been identified to determine whether there's any reason for causality, meaning that this uncommon side effect was at all associated or a consequence with the vaccine. So it's too soon to know. It may just be coincidental. It's a very rare event, but the good thing about this is it demonstrates that our officials are very intent at ensuring the safety of these vaccines at every point in the rollout. So the VAERS system was very effective at identifying a potential signal. Doesn't mean there is cause and effect, but a potential signal, and the officials put a halt on the rollout until there's a deeper dive into the patient information and an assessment as to whether there's any evidence of causality. So going forward from today on until we get further direction from CDC and the FDA, we'll be just administering 2 vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine in the state of Massachusetts. Both of those vaccines are 2-dose series. They're both based on the messenger RNA platform. And we now know that both of these vaccines actually have durable immunity for at least 6 months. And both seem to provide very good protection, even against the circulating variants that we're having to contend with in the state, and probably what's driving some of the increase in caseload in many parts of the country. So as I mentioned, and as we realized over the course of the past 24 hours, safety remains a top priority. And the vaccine adverse event reporting system served its function at identifying a potential signal, and that led to the halt on the J&J vaccine for the time being. We expect that this will take days to weeks to get to the bottom of before we actually know whether there's any causality. And then finally, and then I'm going to open it up, just a question that we often get about how can we have a safe vaccine in such a short amount of time. Literally, we had a vaccine for deployment less than a year after the virus was completely sequenced in China. And the reason why this was possible is because there was a tremendous financial risk that the government took in terms of providing money for the manufacturers to start manufacturing and developing the vaccine so that it was able to be quickly deployed after it was approved by the FDA. There were no shortcuts in terms of the research, the initial development, animal models, the developmental and toxicity studies that were done in these animals. All the 3 phases of the clinical trials were still conducted, but it was because the manufacturing and development programs started when the clinical trials were starting, where typically the manufacturing and development program doesn't start until the manufacturer has a full approval from the FDA. And the reason why this investment was made is because of the serious nature of this pandemic. So I think those are the things I wanted to mention and share with everyone. And at this point, I'm happy to take all sorts of questions related to the vaccines, and I'll turn it back to Mary and Doug.
Thanks, Luann. That was really helpful. One of the things that I wonder about, you mentioned what's going on out in Michigan in the Midwest, and now we know we have less vaccine of J&J. So sometimes I think people feel it's a bit of a race against time. And you mentioned herd immunization that will help. Do you know what the impact of not having the Johnson & Johnson vaccine might mean in terms of the pace? And now that we're opening up on Patriots Day to 16 years old and older, and I think one of the vaccines might be 18. I thought you could talk to that.
Yes.
But do you have a sense of what it might mean? And Doug might also, because we're all struggling to make sure we're bringing vaccine to our communities. So I know I loaded a lot in there, but maybe we can start with you, Luann, about, do you have an idea of the impact of not having that 3rd vaccine on the opening up?
Yeah, honestly, we were being told by the state, and Doug probably can confirm this, that we were not expecting months of the J&J vaccine in the immediate future. And so I don't think it's going to have a big impact on our plans in the state of Massachusetts, because we were not really expecting much of the J&J vaccine. We're expecting more of the Pfizer vaccine at our location, and we still expect to receive, and many facilities and hospitals and clinics will receive the Moderna vaccine. So of course, it's probably going to slow us down a little bit. I know there are some real niches for where the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, because it's a one dose vaccine, and like the homebound patients. I know there was a big plan in the state to use it for homebound patients. And we were using it in hospitalized patients in some of our behavioral health units, because once they're discharged, it's very hard to schedule that second appointment to give them the second vaccine. So it really provided an opportunity to get to some more difficult patient populations. So unfortunately, it's going to complicate those programs, but there'll be plans to have either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine make up for that deficiency. In terms of age, only the Pfizer vaccine can be administered to 16 and 17-year-olds at this time. However, we know that Pfizer submitted their clinical trial data looking at ages 12 through 15. And we expect maybe by the end of May to have a decision about that. So perhaps as early as the summer, we can vaccinate some of the younger kids down to 12. And there are a number of studies in progress looking at pediatrics with the hope of actually going down to 6 months of age.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I think those are some of the points that I would also continue to make. And as we have heard from the state, our contacts over at the state, Secretary Sutters and the Lieutenant Governor, is that we were not anticipating getting a lot of the J&J or the Johnson vaccine coming into Massachusetts through the state allotments that we were anticipating. So that will leave us really in a fairly good position to be able to continue all the work that's been happening, whether those are at the state locations or even through some of our hospitals and clinics that are receiving the vaccine. We are hoping that we're going to see a slight increase in the number of vaccine available so that we can start looking at opening up additional regional vaccine sites. And as Mary and Luann know, we partnered, Somerville and 9 other communities have partnered with Tufts University and Cambridge Health Alliance, or CHA, to bring a regional vaccine location to Somerville as soon as we are able. And we'll be making that announcement hopefully really soon once we know and we are able to secure that vaccine for our community members.
Doug, will you talk a little bit about why there was a regional application and a commitment to bring the vaccine more locally? Can you share with folks the thinking about the vaccine distribution?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that, there's many reasons why we really looked at this. And one is that the way that the state was distributing the vaccine itself was really focusing in on some of the larger mass vaccination locations. In Somerville, our closest one that we had available to us at the time was Fenway Park, which is great. As a crows fly, that's really close for all of us to get to. However, we don't fly. And we know that it's a difficult place sometimes for any of us to get to. The others were some of the larger ones. There was one up in Danvers. There was one down at Gillette Stadium. Again, it's great if you have access to a car or you're a very mobile person and able to get to those. However, we know that in Somerville and our surrounding communities, including Everett, Medford, Malden, who are some of our partners within this, including Cambridge, is that we don't all use cars, and we don't have a lot of us are decide very smartly to live without vehicles. So we walk a lot of places, we rely on transit. It's not easy to get to some of these locations, as well as we know that some of our immigrant community members, as well as some of our families who really are working jobs and job after job and living, going from one job to another, don't have the same capacities to get online, to reserve an appointment and to think that it's that far ahead. So we put a lot of that information together and really wanted to make sure that we were able to bring the vaccine closer to our community members. So we came together, and Mary and I have been working on this for for months, actually, when we talk about how we were partnering with a variety of community members in a variety of communities around here. But it was through that group and some of the work that we were doing that really prompted us to say, we want to put an application together to the state to bring a regional location here. So we were successful in getting the application together. And now we are just waiting for the announcement from the state to say, you're going to have vaccine, and we're able to do that. We'll be working in partnership with Cambridge Health Alliance and their vaccination center, as well as Tufts University to open up a site. And then we're working with the 9 different communities around us to really make sure that we're able to provide direct links to our individual communities and reaching our hard to reach populations. And that can be for a variety of reasons. Lack of transportation. It could be because of scheduling issues that many people have. And we're hoping that this is also going to be able to help us with really reaching some of those with hesitancy about getting the vaccine and making it really easy and convenient for people to get the vaccine. That's going to be the only way we're able to get to some of that herd immunities if we're making it easy and accessible for all.
And Doug, I think we talked about locally, people have known friends in community-based agencies and more trusted friends. It's easier to have the access. We hope it would be more than the 5 days a week, because we know a lot of people are working 2 jobs and we want it to be really convenient. So fingers crossed. And basically what it means for CHA, for instance, it's our patients, but any member of the public in our communities. And so we think that would make it a lot easier.
Yeah.
Luann,
Can I just add one more thing to that, Mary, as
please.
well, is that while we still have, we're still looking at doing them locally, we still encourage people to pre-register on the state's vaccine location, because even though we are going to be working with it locally, we still have to use the state's vaccination locator. So one of the things the state is trying to do is really match up the vaccine location with the zip code and where they live. So certainly do it that way, so you're able to get something that's a little bit closer and hopefully much more manageable to be able to get to, and really eliminate some of those barriers so it's accessible to all.
So thanks, Doug. And that helps. It makes more work, but there's a better record and understanding of who's getting vaccinated and how, and then we learn. And I do want to ask you all about testing a little later. But Luann, one of the questions that really stuck out in my mind was people mentioning that folks don't get as sick right now. They think that if they get COVID, they can be treated. And so maybe a vaccination is the same as getting the treatment. Can you expand on that and talk about the difference? Because there are differences for sure.
Well, I think there's been some improvements. We've learned a lot over the course of the past year, so we're better at taking care of patients that have COVID. But we don't really want people to get COVID. There's this whole long COVID illness that actually is now, called post-COVID inflammatory syndrome, or post-acute COVID syndrome. And it is a debilitating disease, and it could last for several months, and does not require you to have a bad infection. In fact, there are many people who have developed some of these lingering symptoms, bad headache, profound fatigue, dizziness, lightheadedness. They're unable to continue their normal activities, unable to go to work. And some of these people were not that sick. They did not require hospitalization. They were healthy people. Some were athletes. And there's no way of predicting how, if you get infected with COVID, whether you're going to be one of those long haulers or not, or whether you're going to be someone who's going to need to be hospitalized. Now, we do know for hospitalization, there are risk factors. And we know what those risk factors are, things like diabetes and hypertension and pulmonary disease and pregnancy, and I can go on, but we know that if you have some of those comorbidities, you're at a greater likelihood to have a more severe illness. But with the post-acute COVID syndrome, we don't know who's going to get that. We don't know what the risk factors are for you to go on and develop that. So we don't want anyone to get infected with COVID. And we've gotten better at taking care of patients. And I think some of it, we do have some advances in treatment, not as many as we would have liked. There's still a lot of research going on to try and get better treatments for COVID. But really, it's in everybody's best interest not to get infected. And this is not like a childhood illness where natural immunity is often felt to be just as good, like chickenpox. This is not the same. We don't want anybody to get COVID. So I would really recommend that you continue to take the precautions that we all know work, like masking and physical distancing and hand hygiene, and then seek vaccination as soon as you're eligible.
One thing that John's on me having now been vaccinated, and I guess I would ask you both, it's hard for me to take off my mask, even though I'm around all people who have been vaccinated and we wash our hands so much, etc. So in some ways, I feel it's the opposite of COVID vaccine fatigue. But are you noticing that even with the protections, that we've altered a little and we're much more cautious? And I think it's a good thing because it's hard to be internally using one set of standards and then externally another. So I'm just curious with both of you, are you experiencing some of that same phenomenon?
I can talk a little bit about what I'm seeing in when I'm around and about, and we're still encouraging people to still follow all of those practices that we keep talking about, including the social distancing, wearing our masks, because we know that just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean that you're not able to still acquire the virus itself. So we want to keep that in mind, for one. And second, I think it's good practice just to keep in mind as we do this, because otherwise, if we're sitting in a space and somebody else walks in, you're not sure whether or not they have been vaccinated or not. So let's keep up our vigilance, which is really a critical part. And it's another tool in our toolbox to help get rid of this virus, move it through the systems so that it no longer is causing the challenges that it has been. And we're able to get back to the new normal that's out there in the world, and also get back to doing more of the things that we were used to prior to COVID-19.
Luann, can you talk about who's in the hospital these days? And what has changed there?
Yes, we've definitely seen the shift to younger ages being hospitalized. And that was very different from our first surge, where the large majority of our patients were older patients. Certainly the nursing home patients were very greatly impacted, sadly. But we are not seeing the older age group right now in the hospital because they've been vaccinated. Not 100%, but certainly, at least in the country, I think 75% of older Americans have been vaccinated. And of course, some of those that have not been vaccinated probably infected and still probably have some immunity. So we are seeing younger people and sometimes people without comorbidities. So certainly it's the younger people that are getting infected. And also it's the variants that are playing a role now. And we know that the variants that are circulating, the B117 that you've heard about, now makes up more than 50% of the circulating strains in the state of Massachusetts. And we know that this particular virus is 50 to 75% more contagious. And the other thing we know is that it is also more contagious to children, where the wild strains that were circulating, it seems like most of the kids were relatively immune to the wild type, not the B117. So, we have to continue to practice all the mitigation strategies because we have a more contagious variant and because we're not near herd immunity yet.
I think we have a couple of questions, and I think I'm supposed to be monitoring those. So apologies, I'm going to go on to chat and see if I can share in the Q&A chat. All right, let's see if I can find these. Okay. Here's the question. I'm sorry if my face is blocked because of the questions. Why people who were infected before present higher IgG than people vaccinated? should people who were infected before be vaccinated? So that's one question. And Luann, will you mention what is meant by IgG?
Yeah, so IgG is a type of antibody that our body produces in response to infection. And there's usually, when your body produces antibody, there's an early antibody that's produced first. That's referred to as the IgM antibody. And then later on, the IgG produced. And actually, we know with this infection that IgM and IgG actually go up almost around the same time, which is unusual. Usually it's IgM and weeks later it's IgG, but we start seeing IgG much earlier with this infection. And actually, although with natural infection, you see that antibody response, it is far more robust after vaccination. And that is why that people who have been previously infected should still get vaccinated, because it boosts your immune response and is felt to be more long-lasting, more robust, and probably more durable.
So Luann, there's the second part to this question. Second question, what guarantees that the RNA won't enter the nucleus of the cells and touch the DNA of the person?
Yes, so the RNA that's introduced into our cells through the messenger RNA vaccines only enters the cytoplasm of the cell. It does not enter the nucleus. We have enzymes in our cytoplasm that actually destroy the RNA after it's transcribed and the spike protein is produced. So that RNA cannot enter the nucleus where our DNA resides. So there's no integration of the RNA into the DNA, and it's promptly destroyed by enzymes after it's transcribed in our cells.
I have to say how sophisticated that person in the question is. And I don't know if people want me sharing their names or not, so I won't, but I've heard people wonder about, does it affect the DNA? So I have another question here. I had the Janssen vaccine, and it's about 65% effective. And the Moderna and the BioNTech vaccines are around 94% effective at the time of the trial, parents. When do we consider the population obtaining herd immunity? Good, because you mentioned this. Even if 100% were vaccinated, that leaves a large degree of possible infections. So do we continue lockdowns even after we reach herd immunity? And do you think we will need boosters for the P1 and other variants?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we don't exactly know how much of the population needs to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. It's somewhat of a moving target because it kind of depends on the circulating variants, but I think what most people are feeling is though it needs to be like 80% right now. That may adjust if we have more variants circulating that are less susceptible to the immunity induced by the vaccine. So for now, I mean, I'd be thrilled actually if our state achieved 80% by midsummer. I'd be thrilled. Now that's not really going to be possible because we're not going to have enough vaccines for kids yet. And since 25% of the population is pediatrics, but it almost makes us as adults have to be more responsible because our kids are not going to be able to be vaccinated widely, probably until the end of the year or early next year. So I think for adults, we need to play our part to keep our kids safe and achieve herd immunity quicker. There was a second part to that question, Mary.
I'm going to go back. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hang on one second. So do we continue lockdowns even after we reach herd immunity? And do you think we will need boosters for the P1 and other variants?
Yeah, so the question about whether we need boosters remains to be determined. We do not know yet. We know that the vaccines that we have are looking very good 6 months out. That we know. Whether that's going to be maintained at 12 months, 24 months, we do not know. And we know a little bit less about the P1 variant. That's the variant that was first identified in South America. We know less about it. There's reports coming out of Brazil about high reinfection rates. So there's some concern that that particular variant may be more able to escape immunity, but we know less about that. We know that against the B.1.1.7, the UK variant, and the South African variant, the 1.3.5.1, we know that the mRNA vaccines and even the J&J vaccine actually performed quite well.
Doug, I was looking down. Thank you, Luann. It's a lot to keep track of. And so when we talk about fatigue, I was looking down at my phone to see, because the latest update I received from State House News said what percent of the state had been vaccinated. And I don't know if you know that, Doug, but it surprised me. It was higher than I expected. And while according to the comments Luann just made, we're a ways from herd immunity and nearly impossible till kids have a vaccination. I think the state started off slow. Maybe you could tell us about that. And we seem to be catching up somewhat. Doug, can you share your?
Well, I think, this is really based on the number and the amount of vaccine that we're able to get. And I think this isn't just locally, but it's also kind of across the country, that the rollout of the vaccine and the number of vaccines that we had was a little bit lower. And it's now starting to build back up, and it's building up so that we're able to actually administer more and more of the vaccines. And I think we're all trying to really work hard to make sure that no vaccine is wasted and that we're able to get those the vaccines into people's arms. So as we see additional vaccines become available, because the production is starting to go up with the partnerships that are out there, and the systems are increasing the production themselves, we'll have more vaccines so that we're able to get it. One of the things that the state really does work to is try and get everybody, all the vaccines that are delivered are administered fairly quickly within 10 days, if not even shorter time periods within that, so that they know that when we get new supply, it's constantly going out and getting into individual arms. I know one of the questions that was just asked earlier, and I know we didn't quite get to it, is do we still have to worry or are we still going to have to do some of these things even after herd immunities? We may still have to do, like, wearing a face covering, even after we have some herd immunities. Again, going back to what Dr. Luann was talking about, and the whole idea that there may still be, those other variants that are out there. So keeping that vigilance up will still be necessary for a little bit of time, even after we're hitting the herd immunities.
Thanks, Doug. Luann, and this is a Mary question, and I'm sorry, but when you talk about boosters, do we have any idea if a booster, since both Pfizer and Moderna are 2 shots, would a booster likely be just one less, or is it unknown? Do we have any idea what a booster might mean? Even though we don't know exactly, and I'm hoping it's at least a year that our shots last, if not longer.
Yeah, I imagine it would just be one booster, and a booster may actually last longer than the original series. So even if we do need a booster a year, 2 years out, hopefully that will last for a couple years beyond that. So, it remains to be determined whether we'll need annual boosters. If we could control this virus and it doesn't mutate, it's less likely we're going to need to tweak the spike protein. But as long as there's a lot of infection, the virus is mutating, there's going to be new advantages to these mutations. Maybe it'll be more virulent of an infection. Maybe it'll be more contagious. So that's why it's important that we try and control disease, so that we're more than likely not facing annual boosters because of mutations.
Before I get to the question that's in the chat, I wanted to ask you, would a booster be more effective because we've already had 2 shots, or how does that work, Louise?
Yeah, typically your first shot or your priming shot, you get a antibody production, and in this case, in the case of the current vaccines, we also have the other part of the immune system working, the cell-mediated immunity. When you get the second part of the mRNA vaccine, that's considered a boosting dose, and you have a marked reaction to that. So if we have to get another booster or a third shot, so to speak, it is very likely going to even amplify the antibody levels that we previously had.
Thank you. And Doug, I like your name, Dr. Luann. That I like that. So thank you. I'm going to go to the question in the chat and encourage other people. Please send us your questions. You can in chat Q&As. So, how do the outcomes of younger patients compare to older patients? That could be as it relates to if someone is sick with COVID and maybe even the vaccine. So maybe we could answer both.
So in general, I think that what we're seeing and what the data shows is that younger people generally do better because they don't have comorbidities and their immune system is just more robust to respond. And that holds true for a lot of infections. Younger people generally do better than older people with infections. What's changed with this particular variant that's circulating, though, we are seeing more severe disease in some young people. So we are still getting ICU patients with people in their 30s on ventilators. So, in the first surge, it was elderly people, many of whom developed respiratory failure or were on ventilators. But I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a more virulent strain, a more contagious strain. And so some young, healthy people, unfortunately, are getting very sick.
Thank you. Doug, talk to us a little bit about Somerville, who has been independent and fierce in its commitment to keep the community safe. Can you talk a little bit about the plus side of that and also some of the challenges and pushback the city may have faced? And would you ever do anything differently?
So that's a great question. And I think, a lot of people do look at Somerville as being a leader and the work that we've been able to do and kind of stepping forward sometimes sooner than others when we were first looking at the pandemic that was coming around. And really kind of started to think how we were going to work on this and how we were going to structure this. We're lucky enough to have Mayor Curtatone, who's really a leader in these and really kind of takes a lot of information. We do a lot of work in looking at the data and looking at the information that we are able to collect, whether that's around the information such as what Dr. Luann is talking about, and really understanding the viral loads, the transmission of the virus, looking at what the mitigation factors are to make sure that all of those things are happening. We're also looking at the transmission rates, where they're occurring, and how that really can impact our community. We're one that's willing to step out a little bit onto the edge and say, you know what, we see what's happening. We want to close down a little bit sooner. Or we're still seeing a little bit of a spike. And right now, as we see a leveling off, we hope that it stays leveled off. But as we look at our numbers, we know that there's been little bumps that are coming up into the road. We're very concerned with some of with next week being spring break or April break for a lot of people. And we've gotten questions about, what about travel? We know that some of the travel restrictions have changed a little bit. I am not encouraging anybody to travel who hasn't been fully vaccinated and get on an airplane. I really am concerned about as we come back from some of the activities that people may be doing, that we'll be seeing additional cases of COVID popping up in our testing facilities or as we're doing the testing. So we want to make sure that we're staying vigilant. And I think part of what our role is to help people understand why there's a need to still be vigilant for this, because the virus is still here. And when you even just look at the data itself, we're still seeing higher caseloads now than we did when the pandemic was first starting and we were starting just to get worried about it. So we know that those levels are still there and still here. So that's why we want to make sure that we're continuing all of our efforts to keep our community members safe. Now, do we get pushback? Absolutely, we do. But we also know that Somerville's a unique place for us as well, where when we talk about places of business or restaurants, we don't have very big spaces. I mean, I know we all have gone out to the different restaurants here in Somerville. I love going along, Broadway and even up into Davis Square and in any of the squares. We have a variety of great places. They're not big. So really, when you look at the numbers themselves, and you're still following even our state guidance, which is still making sure that we're limiting the number of people and also having those 6-foot distances, That doesn't really change much of the occupancy levels in many of our restaurants. Some of it may, but for most it doesn't. But we also can hear, and when we do our contact tracing, because as you know, contact tracing is a critical part of helping to understand the spread of this virus. I have staff that are working on it 24/7, trying to really understand this. And I have been making many of those phone calls myself. And we're learning and hearing how people are doing it. And we need to make sure that we're able to do that. And part of that is understanding how and when that transmission is occurring. We know as people take off their masks and they're eating in a restaurant, it's a louder place. We're talking. We may have other things. We need to be careful of some of those things. We also are leaders in different ways too, because right now in Somerville, we actually are part of the state pilot project, which you may have gotten social media calls on, which is the Mass Notify. It's a system that's already in many smartphones where you just have to enable the emergency notification on your settings and select the United States, select Massachusetts, and you're enrolled. What will happen is that if you're within 6 foot and be counted as a close contact for somebody who tests positive, and that person is also on Mass Notify, they will simply plug a code into their phone that they will get from the state, and the phone will automatically notify anybody who's within that 6 foot radius during that potential infection period. There's no connection, there's no GPS around that. It's all just Bluetooth that just kind of notices it, and there's no history that's attached to that. In Somerville and in Methuen, who is the other community partner, since we started this just less than a week ago, we've already had over 15,000 people register. Yeah. That's fantastic. We want people to continue to do that. With that particular thing, it's just another tool in our toolbox that can help us with contact tracing. But we still need to stay on top of contact tracing to slow the spread of this virus, because we know that people forget and are not as vigilant as they could be and are getting infected and passing that virus on, sometimes unknowingly. That's why even when we're all vaccinated, we may still need to wear, and we should still be wearing our masks, even when we're with some of our family and friends in times when we're unsure of who may be entering into the building as well.
So Doug, thank you. And I hope maybe in the chat, someone can post the information you shared about how to make sure we can enroll, what we're getting a call or pinged in some way. But can you share a little more, if it's not done as easily as this new system allows, what's involved when your staff is doing contact tracing? It's intensive.
Yeah, the contact tracing can be a lot of work. It's really it's just trying to connect with the person who's tested positive. So if you do get those calls, please pick them up, because we're just here to help. That's all that we're here to do. We're able to do it in multiple languages as well. So that's one of the great things. So, we have Spanish, Portuguese, Haitian Creole, Nepali languages that we're able to actually talk to our community members in languages and understand their language as well as their culture to make sure that we're able to connect. It's really just making sure, one, that you're doing okay, and seeing if there's any supports that you might need from the community itself, whether that's around food, whether that's around getting other people tested in your household, and it could even be around making sure that you're able to get to your doctors if you need supports in that way. Or if you're not able to isolate properly, how can we help you get to a safe isolation location? So we'll be calling them and just checking in with them, but also trying to identify where they may have been previously, so we can do some backwards tracking to see where they may have been infected, but also who they may have been in contact with prior to them knowing that they were infected, so that we can capture them as well within the contact tracing and be able to work with them and get them tested as well. We do know that there's a lot of people who may be asymptomatic and still test positive, and this will help us do some of that tracking as well. So we are still trying to work on a lot of those things, and then we'll give them information about how long they have to quarantine or isolate and their household members, and really doing some coaching along that way as well, so that they can also hopefully stay home, get healthy, and not have to burden any of our hospitals or overburden any areas, because they're able to catch themselves earlier in the infection and be able to work through those things and get healthy faster and back into the community.
And we do want to remind people, and Luann, I want you to jump in, but the testing sites are still there and available. But Luann, jump in, and then I'll go to a question that's come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the technology that Doug was referring to was the smartphone technology for tracing was really instrumental in Taiwan and South Korea, where this was, common knowledge, this technology, and they were used, and it was very successful in keeping the caseload down in those parts of the world. And the US is really behind in this technology. And that's maybe one of the silver linings that we've learned, that we have to adopt more technology. It's very time consuming to do contact tracing over the phone. It could take hours, one exposure to contact, just to get in touch with one of many people that were involved. So we need technology to help us do better.
Thanks, Luann, and thanks for reminding us, because it has been pretty remarkable, Taiwan, and to see how effectively. So thank you for mentioning that. I'm going to go to the question that's in chat. Doug may have spoke to one of the questions. It's a bit of a series, so here we go. What have you been seeing in your contract tracing data? How are people contracting COVID? People not wearing masks with family? And these are all questions. And I'll go back over them, but I just want to put it all on the table, and then we'll peel that onion. So people not wearing masks with family, friends, restaurants. What's the current data on asymptomatic spread?
So yes, and yes.
Yes.
There's all different types of ways that people are still, the transmission is occurring, and it's whenever we know what will happen. It's the droplets that are going from a person who's infected into the next person, and then they're getting into their system, and then the whole process begins. So you have to stop and think of where are ways and when are ways that can actually occur. And it is when people take their masks down and there's that droplets that are able to come out. Where can that happen? Does that happen in families? Absolutely it does. A lot of times what we will see is household transmission. One person may bring it into the household, and then the whole household ends up being infected, because when we're home, that's a safe place. We think we can take off our masks and not have to worry about it, because we're amongst our family, and we call them our pods. Yes. And who is within some of those pods? I agree, we try and keep that in there. But recently, over the past several months, because of COVID fatigue, we get a little bit loose with some of those pods, and we let other people in, and we see how that can then transmit. We've seen a lot of our cases where one person will bring it into the family, and then we're going to see it float through the entire family. And it can also float through the household, because in Somerville, we know that there's many of multi-generational households and homes within our community. When that happens, then it's going from one level to the next level, because we're sharing dinners and we're running back and forth. Their grandma and grandpa are babysitting one day, and we're seeing a lot of the transmissions that are happening in those ways. With friends, again, it's the same thing. Oh, they're my friends. That they were in my bubble, but who else might be in bubbles? The other bubbles that they may be in, and are those bubbles really secure and safe? And we do know that those things are transferring, and we're seeing the virus itself transfer in those ways. You asked about restaurants. There's still that possibility. Again, when we take down our mask, and we eat, there's those droplets. And a lot of times we get excited about it when we're actually out, because we have been locked up, and we have to start thinking a little bit about how we're getting out of some of those things. We might get more excited if we're a little bit louder. And there's a potential for those droplets to come out and transfer to somebody else. So we really do have to look at that. And when it comes down to asymptomatic spread and the data on that, what we are still seeing is that even now, more and more, especially around our younger people, whenever they're first infected and their viral loads are a little bit higher and the transmission can happen, a lot of times they may be asymptomatic. And they're going out and they're doing that. And then it's the next day they start to feel ill. They might have that symptom that they're having, and then all of a sudden, wow, they've had it, but they've already been symptomatic, or they've been asymptomatic, but still able to shed the virus, because they're still within that infection period when we talk about within the virus itself. So we do know that that's happening quite a bit. even now, because a lot of our younger people will start out asymptomatic before they start to feel some of those symptoms.
Luann and Doug, I think many of us tried early on to have as many options for us to understand both testing at sites like CHA did in Somerville, but also there were several researchers that were doing some home testing kits, inexpensive, and that I always thought this would be great for our communities, for school kids, etc. I'm not reading so much about that going on. Is there still a need and important? Would it still help in terms of a tool, the results? Can you be confident in those results? But what's going on there, Luann and Doug?
Yeah, so there are several now over-the-counter tests that have been made available. I think that there might be a lag in accessing them because of production delays. It's kind of like I mentioned earlier, after something gets approved by the FDA, then you have to go into the production and then the distribution phase, and that could take some time. So I think there are new tests that have been approved for at-home use without the need for a doctor's order, and some of these are set up like a pregnancy test. So you do the test at home, you wait 15 minutes, and you get your result. Now, some of them are not as sensitive as the type of test that you would get performed like at the Somerville testing site, because those tests are using the best technology in terms of sensitivity and specificity. It's using PCR, which you can't do at home. But certainly, we still need to test. We still need to have access to tests. So whatever it takes so that people have convenient access to testing is going to be important for us to get out of this pandemic. It's still extremely important.
Thank you. Doug, anything you'd add?
I would agree. And I think part of that is, the testing facilities, both here in Somerville and the Stop the Spread locations, are still available for people. Those can be free of charge. To really do that, and the state is continuing to sponsor many of those. So please continue to think about that. If you put yourself at risk, check out Stop the Spread MA, and you'll be able to identify one of those. Or here locally, we can certainly set you up for appointments and help get that going as well for you. I think it's an important piece. Part of what we're also doing, and many of the school children nowadays are being tested as well through the state or through locally. We are doing it here in Somerville, and we are testing every student who is doing in-person learning. We are doing assurance testing. A lot of people have asked us, well, why continue to do that if we're not seeing high rates? It's an assurance testing. The whole idea about that is to try and keep the virus outside of our system. We've been really successful at doing that and catching people early before they're either entering into the system or just as they start to get that virus. And while they may be asymptomatic, but it's before they're starting to shed the virus, so we can really move it forward. But it's identify, test, contact, trace, isolate are really important pieces to make sure that we can continue to move forward and keep our schools open. We're doing a great job of doing that. And we have a great team of people in partnership with Tufts University, CHA, Cataldo Ambulance, and our school district itself and the city have really partnered to do that. We have a lot of staff who are helping us do these things. And it's a shift in many people's jobs. And I think we've done that all over here at the city to make sure that we're able to support our community members. We have an amazing team of people who've been helping us across the community with all of the work that we've been doing in COVID. And I just want to say thank you to all of them for doing that work. And thank you to all our community members for the work they've been doing to help keep our numbers fairly low. We are doing really well, but we are still transmitting the virus. We cannot let up our vigilance.
I agree with you. I'm really proud of Somerville. And we are so densely populated that people did take all of the precautions. And I'm glad you mentioned, because I was going to ask you about our partnership with Tufts. So Tufts did step up early on, whether it was providing us dormitories for our staff or for overflow from the hospitals. And now partnering, Doug, I think with you on the schools. I also have to say ambulance companies like Dennis Cataldo's pivoted just like hospitals did. Everybody stepped up and did what was needed and continue to do all of that. So maybe you want to talk a little bit more about, I mentioned what I know of Tufts, but I know they've been partnering with the school age kids. And then I want Luann, and I'm giving her a heads up here. CHA has done more research in the past year because we are very practice oriented. We are not a research institute, and we don't do a lot of high-end, what they call quaternary and tertiary care. I don't like those words when you're on one of these shows. It's those high-end, very complex procedures. So we published a lot of research, and Luann, maybe in a minute you could share one or two of those publications that have been pivotal. But Doug, meanwhile, what is Tufts doing right now with the city as it relates to school kids, et cetera?
Yeah, Tufts has been a really good partner for us here at the city. And, the other thing that Tufts has done is they've actually been a leader amongst university and higher education about testing and offering testing to their students and requiring the testing that's there and the protocols they put in place. Of course, there's still going to be times when you're going to have a positive case, but they're also doing their own contact tracing and taking care of their students and making sure that that happens. They've also opened up some of the testing back in the fall to our community members as well. But then when school and in-person learning came on, they were a partner with us to really make sure that we were able to do testing in our schools and working with the Broad Institute and Tufts University. And it's through the Broad Institute or through Tufts University that we were able to get slots over at the Broad in order to run our tests. They also helped create a system and a database for us to be able to track or not track. They're able to actually help us register students, get them in there, identify the students. And now we are doing pool testing where it's multiple students' swabs are put into one pool. It reduces the number of tests we have to run because we have been so successful at staying negative, but it's sensitive enough that if there's a positive case, it will pop. And then we will go back and do both an antigen test. So it's a very quick Bionex Now that was sponsored through the state DESE, Department of Education, as well as a PCR test just to verify all of those. In fact, I have to do a couple tonight because we had a pop in one of our schools today or yesterday, and it's because it was somebody. It was a staff. We think it's a staff member who actually was infected through a family member, and we had those types of things. So we're able to track a lot of these things, and Tufts is helping us do that work, and they're being a partner with us to make sure that we can keep it affordable and really just helping us look at this and actually being able to move us forward. So we're happy to have that partnership. And we're lucky enough to say that we're going to have it over the summer and possibly even the next year if we still need to do that testing.
Oopsie, I see it's 8 o'clock. And as you talk, there are always more questions. I want to give Luann 1 minute though, because we started 1 minute late. If there's any final advice, and not necessarily the research, but as we get ready to say goodnight and thank the audience, lasting comments for us to take away with us.
So I would say that we are in a better place than we were in this last March, certainly, and over the December, January period. So things are looking much brighter, but we maintain our vigilance. We don't want to experience what Michigan is experiencing right now. So the vigilance is really important. And I just want to, thank all of you for your collaboration. I think one of the bright things for me over the course of the past year is I've got to meet so many people that I ordinarily wouldn't get to meet in my everyday job. And the community partnerships that we formed have just been incredible. And the networking has just been awesome. And I think it's sustained all through a really tough time.
And I don't think we'll ever go back to being less networked. And for that, I thank you, Luann, for always being willing and able. And Doug, even pre-pandemic, working hand in hand with our city public health official in particular. And there were issues, whether it was mental health and substance use treatment, whether it's food security. This is work that we've been at it. And the pandemic only made it so much more important that we had an infrastructure in place. So to these partnerships continuing, growing, and being even stronger. Thank you both for the fantastic information.
Right. Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Dr. Luann. I really appreciate you being able to take time to be with us here at the city. The work that you've done, the partnerships that you've been able to give to us, and the supports that we're able to have with you. It's just been amazing. So we do want to thank you for doing that. I also want to say give a big thank you to the people who are behind the scenes
Yes.
here tonight for all of us, whether that's Meredith, Dan, and Sarah, helping us move this forward, our immigrant services group, as well as our communications department here at the city of Somerville, have done an amazing job to help keep everybody informed. If you still want to get more information and want to sign up for any of our blasts and all of our updates, you can go to 311 and sign up that way, or just go into our website at somervillema.gov and certainly sign up that way. You'll get a variety of updates, including anything that we have, including Mass Notify, and be able to sign up that way as well. So we do want to thank you. We want to thank our audience for being here tonight. It's great to have you. Have a wonderful night. Please be safe